In the deepest recesses of our national forests, there are secrets being kept from the public. Hikers missing under mysterious circumstances, strange howling in the forest no one can explain, and bizarre phenomena happening all around us. This compilation episode will take you through 10 of the most recent stories I've covered that clearly defy our reality.
At 11 in the morning, Stephanie was standing in their motel room looking at the clock. Paul still hadn't returned, and they needed to check out, like now. But she wasn't too worried because she figured maybe Paul had just lost track of time taking photos on the trail. But by 11:30, Stephanie's mild concern had turned into real worry. Paul was always very reliable and very punctual, and he knew very well they had to check out of the motel. So she called the park rangers and told them that her husband had not yet come back from his hike. Well, at 2 p.m., the park launched a full search and rescue operation. And over the next 5 days, more than 600 people would join on the search. They logged well over 6,000 hours looking for Paul, and at the peak of the search, there were 90 people on the ground, including 20 different dog teams. ATVs combed the accessible areas while choppers searched from above. You had multiple agencies showing up to help: the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, the California Rescue Dog Association, you had Nevada Search and Rescue, and the National Park Service. But after 5 days of searching, they hadn't found a single trace of Paul. Not his camera, not his hat, not his water pack. There was no signs of him. The official search had to be scaled back. And over the next year and a half, Paul's family organized their own searches. They tried everything: infrared detection, high-resolution aerial photography, more canine teams, but Paul seemed to have completely vanished on that trail. In November of 2019, Paul's sister, Dawn Robinson, was not ready to give up. She managed to get permission for one last search attempt. This time, she brought in a company called Western States Aerial Search to fly drones over the area. The drone team took 6,711 high-res photos of the terrain. They were looking for anything unusual, anything that didn't belong in the natural landscape. And a group of volunteers began going through these photos one by one. You can imagine how painstaking that would be. But on December 19th, someone spotted something in one of the photos. They couldn't tell exactly what it was, but it didn't look natural. So they sent GPS coordinates to the rangers. The following morning, rangers had hiked out to that location, and the first thing they found was a dark pair of cargo shorts. They were size 32 and made in Canada. A few feet away, they found a tan military-style boot, size 9, and as they continued searching the area, they made another discovery. There, partially hidden from view, was a human spine. And not far from that, they found a skull. The rangers kept searching. They found a purple and gray Osprey backpack. Inside were rental car keys, a Nikon camera, some toilet paper, and a half-full water bladder. In January of 2020, the remains were officially identified as Paul Miller. The evidence at the scene told a story, but not the whole story. It looked like Paul had made it to the oasis, then on his way back, he had gone off the main trail, and the rangers pieced together that Paul might have been seeking shelter from an intense heat in a shady crevice, but they couldn't determine exactly what had happened to him. He might have gotten disoriented from the heat, he might have had a medical emergency, like a heart attack or a stroke, or he might have fallen. The location where Paul was found wasn't even far from the trail, but the terrain in Joshua Tree is so rugged and unforgiving that searchers had walked right past this spot dozens of times without ever seeing anything. Now, I want to make a note that Paul had no history of medical issues. He was very physically fit for his age, and he was experienced in the outdoors, and he had water with him. And yet, somehow, on a routine morning hike, something had gone terribly wrong. Now, the exact cause of death was never determined, unfortunately, and his case joined the long list of mysteries in Joshua Tree National Park, where the harsh landscape can turn a simple hike into a life or death situation in a matter of moments. For Stephanie and Paul's family, the discovery of his remains at least brought some closure. But the question of what exactly happened to Paul Miller that morning in July of 2018 remains unanswered. On a quiet evening in December, an unnamed woman stood at her kitchen sink in Bluefield, West Virginia, just washing dishes and looking out her window into the darkening forest behind her house. The rugged mountains of Mercer County stretched out before her as if they were completely endless. Now, initially, she thought the sound she was hearing was just the wind, but she kept hearing these long, mournful howling noises, and it would just make her stop mid-motion, the dishcloth frozen in her hand. Now, as someone who has spent many hours hunting in remote sections of the woods, she knew every animal call there was to know, but she realized very quickly this didn't match any sound. So she quickly dried off her hands, grabbed her phone, and she's calling her husband, and she's like, "Listen to this, can you hear this?" And it was so loud, she didn't even have to hold the phone up. The sound was so loud that it carried clearly through the speaker, and the two of them just stayed on the line listening in silence as these howls just kept going. Now, the woman would later share her story with the Bluefield Daily Telegraph, but she really preferred to remain anonymous, and she noticed a pattern to these sounds. They would always start somewhere around 8:45 and 9:15 at night, and sometimes they'd return around 11 p.m. to midnight. And it wasn't just a single night either, like this kept happening night after night, and the same howls just coming and going. The next few nights, she found herself drawn to her back porch, just standing there in the cold mountain air and just listening. And each time the howls started, they seemed to come from a different direction. Sometimes it sounded like they were coming from deep in the valley, and other times they would kind of come from the ridgeline that was above their property. But no matter where they came from, it was clear that this wasn't normal. This was something far different. They were so long and drawn out, and they would always start low and then build up to this horrible pitch that would just make her skin crawl. And of course, she had consulted with friends who had heard it as well, and they tried convincing her it was coyotes or something, but this didn't sound like a coyote. And in fact, this noise was so loud that it would echo off the mountains and kind of made it impossible to tell exactly where it was coming from. And so one night in particular, she's standing there on her porch around 11:30, and the howls seemed closer than ever before. And they were so powerful, she could actually feel the vibrations in her chest, like the deep bass of a speaker. And her motion activated security lights suddenly clicked on, which illuminated her empty backyard, but the woods beyond remained pitch black. And so she's trying to strain her eyes to see past the light's reach, but she doesn't see anything, but knows the screams are coming from there in the dark. Now, after not finding anything or any source of the noise, the weather finally broke and turned nice enough for her and her husband to check on their deer stand and feed her. And on this day, they would walk down their usual path, and they came across tree branches that had been deliberately placed in these unusual formations. Now, her having hunted this area of woods for years, this wasn't something that an animal had done. And in fact, the previous year, she'd started noticing strange arrangements of trees and branches throughout the woods. Now, fast forward to this year, and these mysterious howls had begun, and so she began thinking back to all the strange things that she'd noticed over the past year. And now that she thought about it, there were other things that she started to piece together that she hadn't really thought of until now. As a matter of fact, her deer cameras had stopped picking up the usual wildlife. And recently, all the noises that you'd hear at night, like coyotes, owls, and all of that, had just gotten quieter and quieter, and some nights it was just completely dead silent. And another thing that was strange too is that there were mornings that she'd find tracks that she could not identify because they were just large and different. She could just tell that the impressions were very deep, but the mud kind of distorted it a little bit. And sometimes they'd be near her deer feeders, which would be completely cleaned out despite her cameras not picking up any activity. It was all very, very strange. And of course, she continued to consult with her friends and acquaintances and other hunters she knew in the area, but no one really had an answer. In fact, some of them seemed kind of spooked to even talk about it. Well, One afternoon, she decided to walk the trail that ran behind her property, and she knew this trail very well because she walked it like all the time, and the recent rains had left the ground nice and soft, and so her boots, kind of sank into the mud as she made her way deeper. And at this point, she was maybe about a quarter mile down the trail, and she stopped because right there in front of her, a massive tree that was blocking the trail. And there wasn't like any thunderstorms or anything that had happened lately that would have caused this tree to fall. Someone or something had to have deliberately dragged this dead tree in front of the trail to block her. A tree that was not easily movable by one person. This would have had to have taken at least several men to move. And probably the craziest part is that this tree wasn't broken or blown down by wind. It was bent like a horseshoe and somehow tucked under another tree. And so standing there at 5'4", she had to crane her neck just to see where the tree had been secured. It was positioned a good 3 or 4 feet above her head, nearly 9 feet off the ground. Now, in all of her years, she'd never seen trees like this. I mean, most people have seen trees knocked down by storms, split by lightning, toppled by age, but it's like, something out of a sci-fi movie. Whatever had done this had to have been incredibly strong. Eventually, she would share these recordings and all of her information with wildlife researchers, but even they were puzzled by what they heard because none of it made any sense. They noted that whatever was making these sounds had to be massive, just based on the volume and depth. And so at this point, she began carrying her recorder with her every time she was outside. Sometimes the howling would be so close that she could hear them clearly. Other times they'd be far from the distance. And to this day, nobody has been able to provide a satisfactory explanation for what caused those screams in the mountains of Mercer County, or who or what had been arranging those trees in such bizarre patterns. But like so many strange occurrences in these ancient Appalachian mountains, the true source of these sounds remains a mystery. At 6:45 in the morning on January 27th, 2012, Dr. William Bill Backus was driving his 2010 Forest Service Jeep Cherokee down Forest Service Road 21, which is about 3 miles from the ranger station. The temperature that morning was around 42 degrees and there was still a light frost on the ground. The morning light was just starting to break through the trees, and Dr. Backus had been the chief scientist at Olympic National Park in Washington State for 15 years. And this morning drive was part of his daily routine. Every morning at 7, he would inspect different sectors of the park, making notes and checking for any issues that needed attention. He was casually driving along lost in thought, and he rounded a bend near the north shore of Lake Quinault, and he suddenly hit the brakes, because what he saw made him get out of his Jeep immediately. There, in front of him, was a scene of absolute destruction. Over 100 massive old growth trees were lying on the ground. Huge Douglas firs and western red cedars that had been standing for like 300 years, many of them reaching heights of nearly 200 feet. He grabbed his field notebook and GPS unit and began documenting what he was seeing. The trees were all splayed out in this weird semicircular pattern. Some of them were completely snapped off at about 15 to 20 feet from their base. Others had been completely uprooted, with root systems around 15 feet in diameter exposed to the air. By 7:15, he had radioed in what he'd found, and 30 minutes later, 3 Park Service Rangers arrived with their full investigation kit: a Nikon D3200, GPS mapping units, and sample collection equipment. The team began a systematic documentation of the scene. They took photos in a grid pattern every 50 feet, they collected soil samples from different locations, and they even took core samples from the still standing trees nearby. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this isn't that big of a deal because windstorms come through areas and blow down trees. However, folks, this wasn't a windstorm. As these men continued to document and inspect the area, they found something really interesting. Near the drainage outlet, all the trees had fallen towards the southeast, but on the western edge, the trees were lying in a completely different direction, pointing north to south. And then on the eastern edge, the trees were lying east to west. It just didn't make any sense, because if this had been caused by some sort of windstorm, all the trees should have fallen in the same direction. This was clearly more complex than any of them had anticipated, and so they reached out to Dr. Cliff Mass, who is a senior meteorologist at the University of Washington, who had over 30 years of experience studying Pacific Northwest weather patterns. And immediately he began analyzing data from 4 local weather stations, including satellites, 3 ground-based radar systems, and 8 temperature monitoring stations. And he looked at 10,000 data points from the 24 hours before and after the incident. There had been no severe weather in the entire area. In fact, the highest wind speed recorded was only 12 miles per hour. There were no microbursts, no severe temperature changes, nothing in the weather data that could possibly explain what had happened to these trees. Now, he found something equally interesting. At exactly 2:17 that morning, there were 3 nearby seismic monitoring stations that had picked up some kind of event. It only lasted 4 seconds, and it registered as a local magnitude of 1.2. But the wave pattern was completely unusual. They checked everything. They looked for fault line activity. They looked for underground gas pockets. They even checked to see if there had been a military exercise or logging operations. Folks, there was nothing. The weather anomaly was such a big deal that for the following 6 months, they would have research teams from 4 different universities studying this site. Everybody was trying to get to the bottom of what happened. They even called in Scooby-Doo. Well, not really, but you know. And they installed motion sensors, weather stations, seismic monitors, and even wildlife cameras. And after various official reports and publications and 3 scientific papers and dozens of Forest Service documentation that was compiled, they still were just as far away from an answer as they were when they started. Somehow, someway, something had knocked down over 100 massive old growth trees that had been standing for centuries and had arranged them in a bizarre circular pattern. But whatever that something was, it left absolutely no trace of itself behind. And to this day, the incident remains one of the most puzzling cases in Washington State's history. Even with all of our modern technology and expertise, nature can still present us with mysteries we simply can't solve. On a warm summer night in 1971, a Marine Guard was standing at his post at the 29 Palms military base in Southern California. The base sprawled across this huge stretch of desert, and at night, it got so dark out there that you could barely see your hand in front of your face. This guard had done this shift plenty of times before, and usually nothing ever happened. He had started his shift at 2300 hours, and he knew he'd be out here until 5 in the morning. He had his standard issue M16 rifle slung across his chest, and he carried his flashlight in his right hand, though he rarely used it. Using a light out here just killed your night vision, and it made you an easy target. The temperature had dropped to about 65 degrees, which was actually pretty nice for this part of the desert. And every couple of minutes, he'd key his radio and check in with his command post. All of it just standard procedure. And between radio checks, he'd stop at each of his designated posts, marking his activity log with the time and his observations. He had just finished writing all clear in his log for the 3rd time that night when things began to happen. At the time, most of the other Marines were asleep in their barracks, and the guard was just doing his normal rounds, walking the perimeter, checking all the usual spots. And every now and then, he would just stop and listen, and at one point or another, he began to hear a noise he wasn't familiar with. It was like this strange shuffling sound, but it was coming from off in the darkness. He couldn't see what it was, and he just kept thinking how odd this was, that maybe it was just the wind picking up some dust. And so he gets closer to investigate, and out of nowhere, this massive figure emerged right in front of him. It was so large that it blocked out the stars behind it, and as it got closer, he could see that it was covered in this thick, matted, nasty hair. It looked almost human-like in its shape, but there was no way it could be human. It was just way too massive. The Marine guard immediately went into his training. He called out for this thing to stop right where it was, but it just kept coming toward him. And so he raised his rifle, aiming it directly at the center of this massive shape. But then it reached out with one of its massive arms, and in one single fluid motion, it grabbed onto his rifle. And then, like it was nothing more than a piece of paper, it just bent the rifle completely in half. He had just enough time to register what had happened before everything went black. The next morning, 2 other Marines doing their rounds found him face down at his post. When they managed to wake him up, he was completely out of it. His eyes were glazed over, he could barely string 2 words together, but he managed to tell them about this massive shape, and right next to where he was his rifle, twisted like a pretzel. No one knew what to make of his story because they knew this guy wasn't a liar, and he was very genuinely spooked about what had happened. As you can imagine, this reached the upper ears of those who worked at this base, and it was taken very seriously. So much so that both the FBI and CIA sent out investigators. During the course of the investigation, something more bizarre came to light. 2 other people on base had seen this same creature that very night. And one of those witnesses claimed they saw something really strange. That whatever this thing was not alone. It had what looked like a smaller version of it walking alongside of it. They put in their official report that based on witness descriptions, this thing had to be at least 12 feet tall. It wasn't just the people on base who knew something was wrong that night. All the people living near the base also told investigators that their dogs had been going crazy, barking all night long. And it was that worried, frantic kind of barking, that dogs do when something is really wrong. It wasn't good, folks. And what's interesting is what happened here seemed to bleed over into nearby areas. Because around that same time, over at Joshua Tree National Park, employees started reporting similar sightings. They were seeing this massive hairy creature moving through the park. Now at the time, they couldn't explain it. Some of them tried to capture evidence of it, but it didn't turn out very well. And within a very short amount of time, all of the sightings just stopped. And for 8 years, there was nothing. There was no sightings, there was no reports. People almost started to forget about it. However, folks, one of the top things that's keeping park staff and hikers alike safe is Bombas socks. Now, wait a minute. Before you skip through this ad, hear me out. Because as someone who's spent countless hours researching these parks and all the strange cases, I know just how crucial proper gear is, especially for your feet. And park rangers walk an average of like 10 miles per day through rough terrain, and they're trying to, fight off Bigfoot and trying to rescue hikers from the unthinkable. So durable socks isn't just about comfort, it's about safety. I've been wearing my Bombas for, quite a while now, and I can tell you these aren't your average socks. And after looking at the 2 years they've spent perfecting every detail like built-in arch support, premium materials like merino wool, and no annoying toe seam that drives you crazy on long hikes, it makes sense that with these you're able to outrun the unthinkable. But what really makes them special is their mission, because for every item purchased, they donate an item to someone in need. In fact, socks are the #1 most requested clothing item in homeless shelters, and Bombas has donated over 150 million essential clothing items to those experiencing homelessness through their network of giving partners. So whether you're hitting the trails yourself or trying to escape a ravenous group of Bigfoot, or you're just looking for the perfect gift for the outdoor enthusiast in your life, these socks have you covered. And new customers get 20% off their first purchase by going to bombas.com/lurks and using code LURKS at checkout. Trust me, your feet will thank you and you'll be safe for the time being. Not to mention, you'll be helping someone out in need. In 1979, Mike and Linda Harrison were driving home around 12:30 at night near their condominium in Desert Hot Springs, California. They just left their friend's house where they'd been playing cards, and they were actually in the middle of arguing about whether Linda had misplayed the last hand that cost them the game. Mike was telling Linda she should have led with the ace of spades, and Linda was saying that if Mike had been paying attention, he would have seen why that wouldn't have worked. It was just one of those stupid arguments couples have, but it meant they were both distracted and irritated when they turned onto that dark stretch of road near their complex. The headlights caught this thing perfectly, and what they saw made them completely forget about their card game argument. Standing there in the beam of their headlights was this enormous figure. Its shoulders had to be at least 4 feet wide, and its head almost looked too small for its massive frame. The hair covering its body wasn't matted or tangled like you might expect. It was actually kind of smooth and uniform, almost like a horse's coat, but longer. And its arms were these massive, powerful-looking limbs. They hung down past its knees, swaying as it stood there. The couple noticed its hands and how huge they were, easily twice the size of a normal human hand, with these thick, long fingers. Despite its size, it seemed incredibly agile and balanced. Michael and Linda were just completely speechless. None of them could say a word. Linda grabbed Michael's arm so hard her knuckles were white, even though Michael had his foot hovering over the gas pedal. He just couldn't bring himself to do it. It's like his brain was in shock and wouldn't send the signal to his foot to press down the gas. To Michael and Linda, this experience felt like it would stretch on for minutes at a time, but in actuality, it was probably no more than a few seconds. And in one fluid motion, this thing just glided off into the shadows and vanished into the yucca bushes, and it took Michael and Linda a few moments to kind of gather themselves before they could even drive off. And folks, it doesn't end there, because not even 2 weeks later, someone else would find something truly baffling. Bill Steele had started his morning like he always did. Cup of coffee at 5:30 in the morning, a quick breakfast of eggs and toast, and then out to check the property before the day got too hot. He was driving his old Ford F-150 along the fence line, something he did 3 times a week, looking for any damage from the recent storms. He just passed his east pasture where he kept a small herd of cattle when he noticed some of his fence posts were leaning at an odd angle. So he pulled over, grabbed his tool belt from behind the seat, and walked over to check it out. That's when he saw them, these impressions on the ground. Initially, he thought maybe one of his cows had gotten out and stepped there, but these weren't cow prints. They were clearly footprints, like a human's, but massive, and they went right through his property in a straight line. Whatever made them knew exactly where it was going. Bill had been working in this land since 1946, and he'd never seen anything like it. He actually went back to his truck to grab his reading glasses, thinking maybe his eyes were just playing tricks on him. But even with his glasses on, these prints were just as huge and just as strange. Bill got out his measuring tape and started documenting what he was seeing. Each print was 1.5 feet long. That's about twice the size of a normal man's boot. Bill did his best to replicate the stride himself, but even with his longest possible step, he couldn't come close to matching the distance. He counted 17 distinct prints before they disappeared into rocky terrain. Bill immediately called the local sheriff's office, and word spread quickly about these strange prints. 2 well-known Bigfoot researchers, Tom Wilson and Mark Stevens, drove all the way from Oregon to investigate. But by the time they arrived, 3 days later, a rainstorm had washed away most of the evidence. They took some photographs and measurements of what was left, but the prints were far too degraded to make casts or do any real analysis. You have to understand that back in 1979, awareness of Bigfoot wasn't nearly as prominent as it was today, especially being outside of the Pacific Northwest. I mean, when people thought about the Mojave Desert and the areas around Joshua Tree, they worried about mountain lions, not giant hairy creatures walking around on 2 legs. Even the local papers didn't really know what to call this thing. Some called it a desert giant, others went with mountain monster, but nobody was really using the term Bigfoot. Something else that was very fascinating was just his reaction. Bill had explained that he had seen pictures of Bigfoot prints up from Washington State and around the Pacific Northwest, but all of those looked very different than the ones on his property. These prints had this weird characteristic where the toes, they were spaced much wider apart, kind of like whatever made them was adapted for walking in loose desert sand. Plus, the hair that Mike and Linda Harrison had described seeing was this light tan color, which is totally different from the dark brown or even black hair that is much more commonly reported in the Pacific Northwest. People were starting to realize they might be dealing with something completely different, their own unique desert-dwelling creature. In March of 1988, two Marines named Ken Fox and Mike Reynolds were driving back to 29 Palms after spending the day skiing at Big Bear Lake. It was about 9 o'clock at night, and they were taking this shortcut through the desert that would bring them on the way back through Yucca Valley through Landers. The two Marines had made this drive plenty of times before, and so they knew just about every turn, including a stretch of road that passed by this old cement factory that just sat there all by itself in the middle of nowhere. There wasn't any other civilization around for about 10 miles in any direction, which isn't really unusual for this part of the Mojave Desert. Ken and Mike had actually been in the middle of planning their next ski trip when it happened. Mike was saying that they should try Mammoth Mountain next time instead of Big Bear Lake, and Ken was arguing that it wasn't worth the extra 3-hour drive. Both men's attention was alerted to something moving in the darkness ahead. Both had been up since 6 in the morning and they were incredibly tired, so it made sense that they both thought their eyes were just playing tricks on them. Now, from the left side of the road, this enormous figure suddenly stood up on two legs and started running across the road in front of their car. The headlights caught the bottom half of whatever this thing was, and Ken could see that it looked almost human, but covered in hair. The top half was harder to make out. It was just this dark, massive shape that Ken would later describe as monsterish, and it crossed that entire road about 150 feet in just 3 massive strides, pumping its arms back and forth just like a person would if they were sprinting. Now, for a few seconds, neither Ken nor Mike said anything. They just kind of glanced at each other, both of them unsure of what to do next. And after being stunned momentarily, Mike yanked the car around so fast, their skis went sliding across the back seat. Ken started digging through the glove compartment looking for Mike's wife's pistol that she always kept in there for emergencies. Ken pointed to this dirt road that led off toward the old cement factory and told Mike, "Drive down it now." Now, on this particular night, it was extremely dark, so they had to drive very slowly. And they got about 300 feet towards this small dirt road, and they could see that this factory was just this massive concrete structure, and it just kind of loomed there in the darkness. And they got closer, and they got really bad feelings about where they were at. Both Marines carefully scanned the darkness trying to find this thing, but they still couldn't see it anywhere. And within moments, the men had stopped the car entirely. Even though Ken had found the pistol in the glove compartment, it somehow didn't make him feel any safer. Both sat there for about 10 minutes before Mike reached over and turned the headlights off altogether. When Ken started to protest, Mike just explained that maybe this thing was staying just outside their field of vision, using the darkness to circle around them. They stayed out there for a little while longer, but eventually gave up because they didn't find anything. Now, a few months go by and their enlistments were up. And even though Ken and Mike never officially reported it, they would still talk to each other about it from time to time because it was just so bizarre and out of place. Even nowadays, with how ubiquitous Bigfoot is and cryptids in general, there are many people, especially in the military and in law enforcement, that are still very iffy about talking about this stuff. For these men, they just assumed they had seen some sort of prehistoric man of some kind, and even though it was frightening, they were privileged. However, it wouldn't be till many years later until these men would come forward and share their experience with researchers. The strange man-like beast all of these people reported seeing is what's most commonly known around the area as the Yucca Man. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of witness reports of this thing that go back centuries, and no one really knows what it is. And it makes you wonder what else is hanging out around the Joshua Tree National Park. Now, to this very day, the Yucca Man remains a mystery. On June 9th, 2013, a 51-year-old man named Dale Stelling stood in the parking lot of Mesa Verde National Park with his wife, Deneen, and his parents. Dale was looking up at this ancient cliff dwelling called Spruce Tree House, and he told his wife that he wanted to go check it out up close. Now, the trail to get up to the Spruce Tree House was really short. It was only about a quarter-mile long, and so when Dale's wife offered him some water for the hike, he just kind of laughed it off. He was like, it's such a short trail, I really don't need any water. And so Dale just turned to his wife and called back that he'd see her in a bit, and then headed off towards the trail. But what nobody knew at that moment was that Dale had no intention of actually going to Spruce Tree House. Instead of taking that short quarter-mile trail, Dale diverted onto this much longer trail called the Petroglyph Point Trail. And about an hour later, around 5 p.m., this retired judge and his family, who were hiking on that same trail, well, they actually ran into Dale right at this spot called the Petroglyph Panel, which was about 1.4 miles from where the trail started. And when they saw Dale, he seemed kind of anxious. He told them that he needed to hurry back because people were waiting for him. And that was the last time anybody would ever see Dale alive. By 7:20 that evening, Dale still hadn't come back from what was supposed to be this quick hike. And his wife and his parents were getting really worried because other hikers were coming back with no problems, but there was still no sign of Dale. And so pretty soon, park rangers began searching for him. And the next day, on June 10th, a massive search operation got underway. They had 60 searchers out there, 2 dog teams, a helicopter flying overhead, everyone's looking for Dale. They even had rope teams that were rappelling the cliffs trying to find the man. And at around 7 p.m. that night, Dale's phone made one final attempted ping to his voicemail, and then there was nothing. During the search, a hiker named Jody Peterson actually reported hearing calls for help coming from somewhere in the area. And the search dogs, they showed some initial interest in this one particular spot, but it didn't really lead anywhere. And so the intensive search continued for about 2 weeks. And then 7 years later, on September 17th, 2020, police got this anonymous tip that led them right to Dale's remains. Now, here's what's really strange is that Dale's body was found 4.2 miles away from where he was last seen. It was in this remote closed-off area of the park that the public wasn't even supposed to be in. When they found him, they also found his driver's license, his credit cards, and his social security card right there with his remains. Now, the medical examiner couldn't find any signs of trauma or any signs that animals had attacked him, so there goes that. And for some reason, the exact location where Dale's remains were found has never been publicly disclosed because apparently it's in this restricted area. Now, there are a few important details about Dale that might help explain what happened to him. Dale was known to be what his family called directionally challenged. He just wasn't good with directions at all, and this day was extremely hot. Like, we're talking 90 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit for those of you dealing with Celsius. And Dale also had no water with him. And another strike against the guy is that he had these previous back surgeries that affected the way he walked. Now, the area where his remains were found had actually been searched back in 2013 when he first went missing. And so to this day, there are all these lingering questions about how Dale ended up so far from the trail and why those initial searches never found him. But once they found his remains, they officially closed the case and ruled it as likely death from natural causes. Now, the Mesa Verde National Park is pretty rough and it's very massive. It's got deep canyons, ruins, forests. So when Dale went missing, the search teams basically had to cover this incredibly large area filled with spots where somebody could easily vanish. Even stranger was that when Dale went missing, the weather conditions were actually perfect for searching. There hadn't been any rain, the ground was dry, visibility was great, so tracking somebody should have been pretty straightforward, but for whatever reason, even with all these professional search teams and highly trained dogs, they just couldn't pick up Dale's trail. Also strange is that during the initial search, One of the dog handlers actually said something that would later seem kind of prophetic. This handler mentioned that sometimes when people get lost in the Mesa Verde, they end up in places that just don't make any sense, like they'll be found miles away from where they should logically have gone, and that's exactly what happened with Dale. Now, probably the strangest thing about the case is the anonymous tip. Somebody knew exactly where Dale's remains were in this restricted area that people weren't supposed to be in. Unfortunately, the person never came forward during the search when Dale might have still been alive, and police have never revealed anything about this anonymous tipster. They won't say if it was a park employee, a hiker who had been somewhere they shouldn't have been, or somebody else entirely. Now, if somebody had robbed him or attacked him, you'd expect his personal belongings to be gone, but it wasn't. Park rangers who have worked this case have said it is one of the most baffling disappearances they've ever dealt with. How does somebody leave for a quarter-mile hike and end up on a completely different trail and then somehow make it 4.2 miles away into a restricted area, and then not be found for 7 years despite a massive search effort? Stranger still is that restricted areas and national parks aren't just roped off for no reason. They're places that are so dangerous that even experienced rangers need special permission to go into. But somehow, Dale, someone who is known for getting lost easily and had trouble walking because of his back surgeries, managed to get past whatever barriers were supposed to keep people out of these places. And he did this in 90-degree heat with no water. What's crazy is that the Park Service actually changed some of their protocols about how they monitor these areas. They installed more surveillance equipment, started doing more frequent patrolling, but they've never explained exactly why Dale's case prompted these changes. Maybe they know something about what happened out there and they're just not telling us. To this day, Dale's poor wife, Deneen, says she still has nightmares about what happened to him in his final moments. Unfortunately, like so many cases involving people who vanish in national parks, Dale Stelling's death remains a mystery. In the early summer of 2019, James Caravello was working nights at Yellowstone National Park. James was 34 and had been a park ranger at Yellowstone for several years. Before that, he had served in the Coast Guard for a brief time, and among his colleagues, James was known for being extremely level-headed and reliable. James lived alone in the ranger housing complex near the west entrance, and every morning before his shift, he would stand in this exact spot and take in the view. James had his coffee in one hand and was watching the early morning fog roll through the valley. The park was quiet, but on this particular morning, something caught his attention that seemed off. The distinct sound of helicopter blades cutting through the morning air. When James looked, he realized several things. Firstly, this chopper was flying way too low, and secondly, it was completely black with no markings of any kind. James watched as it emerged from behind the tree line, and it was moving slow, almost like it was searching for something. Now, during his time in the Coast Guard, James had worked with plenty of military aircraft, but even he knew there was something off about this. Most military aircraft, even though used for covert operations, often have some kind of identifying mark, even if subtle, but to have a completely black chopper suggests something more sinister. The helicopter was flying directly over a section of the park that was restricted to all air traffic. So James pulled out his phone to take a picture, but by the time he got his camera ready, the chopper had vanished behind the mountains. Now, he couldn't quite place his finger on it, but something in his gut told him there was something off. After this, he went about his normal morning routine. He made himself a second cup of coffee in the break room, checked the daily incident reports, and headed out for his first patrol. Being a ranger meant most of his day involved petty, mundane tasks, checking permits, giving directions to a lot of tourists, and making sure nobody was feeding wildlife. James spent the next few hours helping a family whose car had overheated near one of the geysers, and writing up a citation for someone who had wandered off the marked trail. It was the kind of standard day he had done hundreds of times before, and in the afternoon, while patrolling one of the trails, he came across several SUVs parked on one of the service roads. These weren't parked vehicles, and they didn't have any government plates or markings. When he approached the vehicles to investigate, they were empty. He pulled his ranger vehicle to a stop about 20 feet behind the black SUVs, and he just sat there for a moment, watching for any movement, but there was nothing. And so he stepped out of his vehicle and began walking towards these mysterious cars. And the closer he got, the more unusual these vehicles seemed. They were completely clean, which made no sense because the service road they were on was really dusty. and James walked up to the driver's side window of the first SUV, cupped his hands around his eyes to look inside, and the interior was completely empty, not even a piece of paper on the seat. He made his way to the second SUV and did the same thing again. Now it was spotless, locked doors, so he walked around both vehicles looking for any identifying marks or plates, but there was none. It was like these vehicles had just appeared out of nowhere, even though the tire tracks leading up to where they were parked seemed to just start suddenly, as if these SUVs had been dropped from the sky. Now, after about 10 minutes of investigating and trying to figure this out, James pulled out his notepad and wrote down the exact location and time. He considered calling it in, but something in his gut told him not to. Instead, he got back in his vehicle and continued. When he drove past the same spot 3 hours later, the SUVs were gone, and there were no signs they had ever been there. Well, a few days after that, James noticed that a large section of the park had been suddenly fenced off. There was a sign that said it was a maintenance area, but James knew there was no maintenance scheduled for that location. In fact, that area wasn't even on any of the maps. And shortly after this happened, James started experiencing bizarre radio dead zones. During his normal patrols, his radio signal would just randomly cut out. Keep in mind that this had never happened to him before. However, during the course of all of this, James would often hear these bizarre sounds that were similar to whispering. Now, shortly after this, James walked into the ranger station office one morning and found his supervisor sitting at his desk. And so James told him about all the radio dead zones he'd been finding and explaining how his radio would just suddenly cut out in areas where it had always worked fine before. His supervisor barely had to look up at him from his paperwork and just said it was probably due to some routine maintenance on the radio towers. Probably wasn't true because this wasn't like a typical maintenance issue. Not believing what he said, he just pressed his supervisor harder, and that's when the man's entire demeanor changed. He just put down his pen, looked directly at James, and told him to drop it. So, when James tried to argue that this was a safety issue, he just calmly got up and walked out of the office. Not satisfied with that interaction, James would bring this up with another supervisor, and his response was far more strange. The moment James had mentioned the radio dead zones, this man's face just went pale, and he quickly changed the subject and made an excuse to leave. So, James noticed after that this man started avoiding him whenever he could. Now, that evening, James was reviewing his patrol logs when he realized something that made his stomach drop. Every single radio dead zone he documented was in or near one of the new restricted areas. But when he tried to access the maintenance schedule for those areas, he discovered his computer access had been revoked. Now, there were similar strange reports that had started appearing in and around those areas, specifically in the backcountry. And in one area in particular, a cluster of elk remains were discovered. There were 3 elk skulls that were found in close proximity. Though not perfectly arranged, there was no blood at the scene, and the only thing they found was the heads, which appear to have been cut with very sharp tools or blades. Other reports of unusual animal deaths began to surface around this time, and there was one that involved a bison carcass with large sections of hide removed, seemingly again with a sharp instrument. Another report described a deer carcass with its internal organs exposed, but they were also melted, as if it had been exposed to intense localized heat. And you had the surrounding foliage, which showed no signs of scorching or fire, which again suggested a highly focused energy. The left side of the deer, which was touching the ground, appeared viscous and gelatinous in consistency, like the flesh had begun to melt. Tissue samples had been collected, but nothing conclusive had come from it. Strangely, despite the apparent heat damage to the flesh, the deer's fur on the affected side remained largely intact. But one of the most bizarre was a deceased juvenile grizzly bear found lodged in the branches of a large tree. The manner of death is disturbing. A significant portion of the bear's skull was removed, with the brain and eyes missing. Upon inspection, it looked as if the bear had been placed there and could not be explained away by scavengers or other natural means. Now, this was all happening around the same time that the black helicopters were being spotted in and around the area. Now, fast forward to July 15th, 2019, and James was patrolling right around the Old Faithful area when he spotted these unusual lights coming from inside one of the restricted zones. And so he drove closer to investigate, and he saw multiple military transport vehicles parked in a clearing. Now, James is trying to figure out what the heck is going on, and he notices these huge containers. I mean, massive. Some of them looked like they were, holding something. They were covered, but you couldn't see inside. They were big enough to hold what you could only imagine. And he's looking at this whole scene, trying to figure out what's going on, and there were men walking around in what appeared to be hazmat-like suits. But before James could get any closer, he was stopped by an armed personnel who said they were part of a geological survey team and told him to leave the area immediately. Well, after that night, James really began documenting everything strange he saw. He noticed the helicopter activity would increase during new moon phases, and his equipment would experience weird electromagnetic interference near certain areas. And he started finding strange tracks that didn't match any known wildlife in the park. Now, around 2:15 in the morning on August 2nd, James was driving down one of the maintenance roads near Shoshone Lake. Earlier that same evening, 3 different hikers and tourists had reported seeing strange lights in this area. James figured it was probably just people camping where they weren't supposed to, but as he rounded a bend in the road, he saw something that made him immediately kill his headlights. Up ahead were multiple military-style vehicles with their lights on, illuminating what looked like a makeshift checkpoint. James could see armed personnel in tactical gear standing guard, and so he pulled his vehicle off the road and into some brush. He grabbed his gear bag and quietly made his way through the woods, using his 8 years of experience to move quietly through the darkness. After about 20 minutes of careful movement, he found a position on a small ridge that overlooked whatever this operation was. He pulled out his binoculars and settled in behind a fallen tree. The entire hillside below him was lit up with these portable floodlights. There were dozens of people in what looked like hazmat suits moving between different stations. Some had clipboards, others were operating strange-looking equipment he'd never seen before. That's when James heard this loud mechanical grinding sound, and he watched through his binoculars as he could see these massive hydraulic doors that had been built into one of these large containers began to open. Additionally, he also saw multiple containment units that looked like these giant glass tubes that were being wheeled out on some kind of track system. Each unit had what appeared to be monitoring equipment attached to it. Through the glass, he could clearly see that there was some kind of being coming out of the container, and he would describe its skin as being pale and almost translucent, and that it was easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and it moved very unnaturally, and he could see that the armed personnel who were handling this being were being very methodic, being very careful, and the entire area was bathed in this strange bluish light that seemed to be coming from inside these containers. Instantly, James just felt this wave of nausea crash into him, and his head started pounding like someone was driving a nail into his skull. Not knowing what to do, he just reached for his radio to call for backup, but got nothing but static. When he checked his GPS unit, the screen would just show gibberish. Fighting through the headache, he pulled out his phone and tried taking pictures, but every time he tried to focus on the containment units, his phone's camera would glitch out. After this, he just fled the area, unsure of what to do. Now, this weighed really heavy on his conscience for days and days, and the following next few mornings, he spent hunched over his toilet, violently ill from whatever had happened to him from what he had saw. In fact, he had called in sick, which is something he'd never done in all the years he'd worked. Now, when he finally made it back, things definitely felt different. There was now what appeared to be military vehicles in certain administrative areas, and teams of men in tactical gear doing what appeared to be routine patrols. The gist that James got was that these guys were searching for something, or maybe guarding something. A lot of the areas accessible by the public remained open and untouched, so tourists and hikers probably didn't notice anything. But in certain areas that were only accessible to staff, well, some of it was blocked off due to geological instability, which is really interesting because months prior to this, there had been several UFO sightings and video recordings taken in and around this area. Now, disturbingly, a park employee named Sean had submitted several videos to his supervisors showing these strange lights hovering over the caldera area. The footage showed 4 different types of UFOs over the course of just 1 month. Oddly, the correlation here is just really strange because all of these sightings were all concentrated in the same areas where he'd been finding those radio dead zones. And for James, the dates of these sightings lined up perfectly for when he first started noticing the black helicopters and unmarked vehicles. And like I said, for whatever reason, James noticed there was this heightened increase of activity during certain lunar phases. Now, during this time, 4 of his fellow rangers were suddenly transferred to other parks with no notice. When James had asked about this, his supervisor would just say it was routine staffing adjustments, but there was nothing routine about how quickly they disappeared. They were just there one day and then gone the next. And perhaps one of the strangest aspects of this entire story is that you had multiple tourists and hikers reporting the same thing over this small window of time. Low humming noises that would make them feel extremely sick. Several had reported other strange events while on trails and in camping areas. Everything from eclipse-like events where the day would suddenly turn to night momentarily before going back to day that nobody else beside them seemed to experience. You had people experiencing missing time and other strange anomalies like lights in the sky and strange crafts being spotted. And of course, nothing was ever officially addressed. Like the crafts that were caught in Sean's video and reported by hikers and park visitors, it was all written off as nothing more than just weather balloons. And one of the most sci-fi like things to have been spotted in and around, well, not just Yellowstone, but other national parks as well, is what people have described as these large black boxes or cubes just showing up at random. They vary in size, but all are reported to be relatively large and of unknown origin. One park ranger, similar to James's case, explained that there was just a lot of military activity right around the time one had been reported by a couple of hikers near one of the trails. A man who used the name Brendan decided to share their story.
I've held on to this story for a while now, not quite sure how or even if I should tell it, but seeing how there seem to be more people stepping forward with bizarre incidents from parks around the country, I figure maybe it's time I share mine. I'm keeping my name and any super specific details under wraps because I signed paperwork, non-disclosure forms basically, that I'm sure would get me in trouble if anyone traced this back to me. I'm not looking for notoriety or anything like that, just a bit of release from what's been weighing on my mind. Back in 2019, I spent about 9 months working as a seasonal employee at a well-known national park. I'd prefer not to name which one for reasons I just mentioned. My main duties varied. Sometimes I'd be helping the front desk at the visitor center. Other times I'd be out on the trails doing light maintenance or guiding hikers when they got turned around. The landscape was gorgeous. One incident, though, made me question everything about that place. It was late spring, maybe early May. I remember that because the snowmelt was in full force, but the heavy tourist crowds hadn't arrived yet. We had a surprising number of calls coming in about a large black box that hikers claimed to have spotted near a lesser traveled trail. At first, I brushed it off as a weird rumor, or maybe someone was playing a prank. Folks sometimes haul out odd objects to the woods to take strange photos, believe it or not. But after the 3rd or 4th mention, in just a couple of days, I mentioned it to my immediate supervisor. He told me to go take a look. So, one morning when I was scheduled for trail patrol, I set out. This particular trail wound through thick pines, not heavily maintained or marked, and because of that, it's rarely crowded. The clearing in question wasn't too far off the main path, surrounded by tall ferns, a little trickle of a stream. But as I approached, I noticed a heaviness in the air, like static electricity before a lightning storm. And in the center of the clearing, there was indeed a large black box. just sitting there in plain sight. Or at least the finish was matte black, with no logos or markings I could see. It was maybe 8 feet tall, about 6 feet wide, though it was hard to gauge precisely. Perfectly rectangular, like a shipping container, but smaller, and without any visible doors or hinges. The second I stepped closer, the air got thicker. That's the best way I can describe it. My ears felt like they were popping, like sudden altitude change, and I had an immediate sense of dread. I'd never felt that kind of raw, primal fear before, not even when I had close calls with wildlife. Almost like every cell in my body was screaming, "Leave now." The closer I got, the stronger the feeling of static, and the more my stomach churned. I saw nothing but smooth, dark surfaces. No seams, no keypad, no vents. Just a big black monolith out of nowhere. I was maybe 10 feet away when I decided I needed backup. I wasn't going to figure this out on my own. I radioed in to my supervisor, describing what I found. He didn't say much, just told me to get back to the station immediately. No clarification, no follow-up questions. I remember my supervisor was very stern, and he explicitly stated, "Do not talk about this with anybody else. Do not talk to other staff about it." And so it was unlike him to be so abrupt. When I got back, I tried to press him for details, but he shut me down hard. He actually said words to the effect of, "You didn't see anything, and we're not discussing this further." My supervisor was always just a really great guy, and this was really out of character for him. And so, the next day I arrived for my shift a bit later than usual. My schedule had changed ironically, and I was slotted for front desk duty at the visitor center. Around mid-morning, I saw an unusual number of vehicles rolling in. Military convoys, if you can believe that. A couple of big trucks and a black SUV or two. They headed toward, I can't remember the name of it, but it's a lesser-known trail that runs parallel to it. The entire area was suddenly roped off, closed for maintenance, or some nonsense like that. But I'd never seen a closure happen so quickly. Signs went up overnight. No staff allowed, save for a select few. The word around the ranger station was that some kind of high-priority ecological study was going on, but I know BS when I hear it. Other staff were confused too, but that section stayed restricted for the remainder of my tenure. But this was strange. But I did pass a vantage point once near a ridge where I saw a cluster of men in military fatigues stationed at the edge of that clearing. That's all I want to share without risking too much.
Just like with Brendan's story, James too was threatened. Right around the end of August of that year, during the height of all of this, James was called in by one of his supervisors at the time and was basically threatened for snooping around in areas he shouldn't. James, who was obviously very caught off guard by this, tried to pry for more information about what he had done wrong, but the only response he was given was to just leave it alone, to stop snooping. And within days, James was just sitting at his kitchen table one morning, reviewing his notes from the past few weeks, when he heard a knock at his door. Now, he looked through the window and saw there was a black sedan that was parked in his driveway that hadn't been there a moment ago. So when he opened the door, 2 men in identical black suits were just standing there on his porch. They didn't show any badges or ID, they didn't introduce themselves, and the taller one of the two just asked if they could come inside to discuss some administrative matters. James realized he was probably in a lot of trouble, and so he just led them to his kitchen where all of his notes were spread out across the table. But before he can gather them up, because he was kind of embarrassed by it, the shorter man of the two picked up one of the papers and began reading it. The taller one just stood there and stared at James without blinking, and so the shorter man began asking him about his recent activities and asked him if he had been into any restricted areas. Had he witnessed anything unusual? Had he discussed his concerns with anyone? And there was just something very off about how he spoke. It was almost mechanical. And after a short conversation, the tall one just looked right at James and explained that they had reviewed his military service record and that it was impressive, but that It would be a shame if his promising career ahead of him had to be cut short. The shorter man simply placed James's paper back on the table and smiled and told James that some things in the park were classified for good reason, that sometimes the best thing a person could do for their country was just to forget about what they'd seen. And before leaving, the taller one placed his business card on the table. It was completely blank except for a phone number, and all he told James was that to call the number if he remembered anything else he needed to forget. So after they left, James just ran to the window and watched as their sedan pulled away, and of course, he noticed it had no license plate. When he went back to his kitchen to gather up his notes, he realized the paper the shorter man had been reading was now gone. After this event, James really began to fear for his life, and this is when he kind of began to withdraw from his normal social activities outside of work. He became much more reclusive and stopped documenting anything unusual. He had no idea how high the stakes were, but knew that things were now getting out of hand quickly. There are other stories that go back decades, stories that suggest something strange has been happening in Yellowstone for a very long time.
It was in the winter of 1980, and my older brother and I were hiking and camping in Yellowstone National Park. After a 5-mile hike from the road up to a lake that reportedly was the only place in North America to catch Arctic grayling other than in the Arctic, we set up camp for the night. After eating our day's catch and cleaning up, we settled in for bed early as we could for the night. We were exhausted from the day's hike and fishing. We were in our tent, quietly talking and starting to get drowsy when we suddenly heard something run by us, but it was on 2 legs, something very large and heavy. We looked at each other with eyes bulging out of our heads, and I told him to go see what it was. He replied, "No effing way." And as we had no sidearms or weapons, we both just sat there, terrified for the rest of the night. Well, at daybreak, we broke camp and left there, looking for tracks, but because the ground was bare, there was no sign of our midnight visitor, except for our experience. The footsteps were extremely heavy, and I know for a fact they were bipedal and running at an unhurried pace, like it was trying to cover some ground. I can't remember if I said this already, but this was in October of 1980, and I can't remember the name of the lake. It was one of the headwater lakes.
You have these reports from 2019, James's experiences, animal mutilations, the military presence, strange lights, the missing time, and then you have stories like these ones from almost 40 years earlier and further back. All the while, strange things kept happening. It was during this time that James tried reaching out to a close friend using encrypted communications. This friend could help him open the door for sharing the information to the public. However, shortly after the conversation, he began receiving threatening phone calls from unknown numbers telling him very personal details about his life, and various threats included. With everything that James was risking losing, he decided to not pursue his investigations and stopped altogether. James lives in a small town in the Pacific Northwest. He works as a private wilderness guide and refuses to discuss anything about Yellowstone after this, but he still experiences occasional surveillance, and he still refuses to tell his full name. It makes you wonder what's really going on in or underneath Yellowstone. On a warm morning in 1923, a 10-year-old boy named Norman Macy walked through a pasture in Mount Airy, Illinois, leading his family's horses to graze. Norman did this every morning, and usually it was pretty uneventful. Norman was used to being up early. His dad had always told him that taking care of the horses was a big responsibility, and Norman took that very seriously. Usually by this time in the morning, the sun was just starting to warm things up and burn off the morning dew. The grass was still wet around his ankles as he walked, and he could hear birds starting to wake up in the trees nearby. It was just a normal morning. Nothing seemed out of place, and he loved these quiet moments before the rest of the town woke up. And as Norman was walking the horses to this big open field, he noticed these really bright lights up ahead. It was very out of place, and at first, he figured it was maybe the sunlight reflecting off something like metal, but he crept closer and realized what he was looking at wasn't farm equipment like he initially thought. Now, about 50 feet away from Norman was this huge metallic craft right there in the middle of the field. And so he's frozen staring at this thing, and the craft also had this large dome on top with these weird holes all around it, and it was sitting on 3 legs that were keeping it off the ground. Standing around this craft was what was even stranger. They were 5 beings that looked almost human, but not quite. Norman's first thought was that maybe they were children because of how short they were. But as he kept watching, he could tell these weren't any kind of people he'd ever seen. Their skin was really pale, almost glowing, and their movements were different, like they were so smooth and deliberate, kind of like moving underwater. And they had blonde hair. It was like white hair, actually. And their eyes were different as well, much larger than a human's. They were very focused, doing some sort of repair work on their craft. It was very intense. Norman related it to like he was watching doctors perform surgery. After all of these things occurred to young Norman, that he was clearly seeing something out of the norm, his heart began racing, but for some reason he didn't feel scared. He was very fascinated, and so he just kept standing there watching these beings while they just seemed to be working on their craft. He also noticed that one of these beings was sitting in what looked like some kind of chair. Norman could hear the others referring to this one as Commander, and he could hear them talking to each other, but obviously it wasn't English, right? I mean, the sounds they were making, it wasn't like any language he'd ever heard. He would later describe it as being almost musical with these weird rising and falling tones, but in his head, he could understand what they meant. He heard one of them say something about stabilizers, and another mentioned something about atmospheric pressure. The Commander, who was sitting in what looked like some kind of floating chair, kept nodding and making these quick hand gestures that the others seemed to understand immediately. There were also strange mechanical sounds coming from the craft, like a humming that would change pitch every few seconds, and the lights on the craft would kind of pulse and change colors with the faint blue light. Suddenly, without warning, the beings seemed to notice they were being watched, and the one they called Commander looked directly at Norman, and immediately everyone, meaning them, the beings, stopped what they were doing, and that's when Norman watched as these things quickly moved towards their craft. The 3 legs that were holding up this craft suddenly retracted, and then this thing began to rise up into the air. And before Norman could even process what was going on, it just shot off towards the west at a very high speed, way faster than any aircraft Norman had ever known. Norman couldn't move. His legs felt like they were made of lead. He just kept staring at the empty space where the craft had been, and his hands were shaking so badly he had to let go of the horse's reins, but the horses hadn't moved. They were still just grazing like nothing had happened. Now, when Norman finally managed to move again, he noticed the grass where the craft had been sitting was pressed down in a perfect circle, and it felt warm to the touch. He could smell something too, like the air right after a lightning strike. Norman knew he had to tell someone what he'd seen, but who would believe him? He was just a kid after all. But he also knew he'd never forget what he just witnessed. His whole body was tingling like he'd just been standing next to something incredibly powerful. Now, for years after this, he would tell this story to people, but again, this was 1923, so it was long before people had any idea of UFOs and how commonly they were reported. Most people assumed Norman was just making all this up for attention, or maybe he dreamt it. But to this day, it remains one of the earliest documented close encounters with what appeared to be extraterrestrial beings on American soil. The most interesting aspect is how similar these beings Norman described, 4 feet tall, blonde hair, and it would match the descriptions that would come decades later in other UFO encounters. On the evening of June 29th, 2018, Taylor Ross and his 3 friends had just parked their car near an old hiking trail deep in the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho. Taylor and his friends were all students at Boise State, and they'd driven out here because they'd heard about this really remote hiking spot that supposedly had incredible views of the valley. None of them had ever been to this part of Idaho before. The 4 of them grabbed their backpacks from the trunk and started heading down this narrow dirt path that vanished into the trees. Right away, Taylor noticed how quiet it was out here. There weren't any other cars in the small gravel lot where they'd parked, and they couldn't hear any sounds of civilization. As they walked deeper, the trees got thicker and the path got harder to follow. They had to use their phones as flashlights because the tree cover was so dense that barely any light was getting through, and it was getting colder too. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees since they'd left their car. Taylor's friend Michael kept checking his phone's GPS, but they hadn't had any signal for the last 30 minutes. The hiking app they'd been using to navigate had stopped working minutes after they left the car, but they figured they couldn't really get lost if they just stayed on the path. The group had planned to hike up to this lookout point that was supposed to be about 2 miles from the parking area, but after walking for what felt like way longer than it should have taken, Taylor started to wonder if maybe they'd missed a turn somewhere. Now, one thing that really began to bother Taylor was just the complete lack of wildlife present. I mean, this is the woods for crying out loud, and there weren't any birds or squirrels or anything. Now, I know this was technically in the evening time, but still. And at one point, the path in front of them was extremely overgrown, and so they decided to cut through into this small game trail that was on their right-hand side. And here, one of Taylor's friends mentioned that they should explore this game trail and that it might lead them to a neat camping spot off the beaten path. The group agreed to take this and began to make their way through the dense brush. And this brush was so thick that Taylor had to push his hands and just try to get all the brush out of his face. And his backpack kept getting caught on thorns, and the ground was getting mushier with each step. At the time, Michael was leading the group, and at some point, he stopped suddenly, causing everyone behind him to bump into each other. And so Taylor asked him what was wrong, but he told the group to listen. And for a moment, everybody just stood there in silence. But there was nothing to hear. There was just this heavy silence that just pressed down on them. Even their footsteps in the mud seemed muffled. Now, the sun was getting lower now, and the forest was getting darker by the minute. So Taylor pulled out his phone to check the time, but his battery had dropped to 15%, even though it had been fully charged when they left the car. But they just continued pushing for another 10 minutes until the game trail opened up into this rather small clearing. It was maybe 50 feet across and perfectly circular, like somebody had intentionally cut down all the trees here. And the weird thing was, there wasn't any undergrowth here. It was just all bare dirt. Michael pointed out that this would actually make a pretty decent camping spot and suggested maybe they should mark it on their phones for next time. But Taylor wasn't really listening anymore. He was looking at something on the other side of the clearing that just didn't seem right. Through the growing darkness, Taylor could just barely make out what looked like the edge of a structure tucked into the tree line on the far side of the clearing. He thought it maybe was just a weird formation of rocks or fallen trees, but his eyes adjusted more, and he could see the distinct shape of a roof. So Taylor pointed this out to his friends, and they all just kind of stood there squinting through the darkness, trying to figure out what they were looking at. Now, one of Taylor's friends pulled out their phone and shined the flashlight towards the structure, and sure enough, there was this old log cabin just sitting there. It looked like it had been there for quite a while. I mean, the logs were dark with age and covered in moss, and there was a small window on either side of what must have been the front door. But Taylor couldn't really see inside because the glass was so dirty. The roof was partially caved in on the back corner, and Michael started walking towards the cabin, saying how cool it was they'd found this place. But Taylor just wasn't feeling right about the whole thing. I mean, even up to the cabin, there was no walkway, there wasn't a cleared area. It was like this cabin had just been dumped right here in the middle of nowhere. And as they got closer, Taylor could see that somebody had nailed boards across the front door in an X pattern, but some of the boards had rotted through it and fallen away. And there were also deep scratches in the wood around the door frame, like something had been trying to get in or maybe get out. The group gathered around the front door, and Michael reached and gave it a push, and the door, kind of creaked open about halfway before getting stuck on the warped floorboards inside. And instantly, this blast of stale, musty air just hit them, and Taylor caught a whiff of something else. Something that smelt like wet dog and rotting meat. And they were able to kind of squeeze through the gap at first, with the others following. And at this point, the overwhelming stench of blood hit them. And it was so bad that Taylor's friends gagged and covered their mouths with their sleeves, and they would kind of sweep their flashlights across the cabin, but there were animal carcasses everywhere. There was a half-eaten deer propped up against one wall, its ribcage torn open. Scattered across the floor were the bones of smaller animals like rabbits, foxes, maybe even a coyote, and all the bones had these deep scoring marks on them, like something had been gnawing on them. There was also a metal bed frame that was pushed up against the wall at this weird angle, like something had shoved it aside to make room for its own sleeping area. There were also deep claw marks in the wooden walls, and some of them head height on a tall person. It was evident that whatever was living here was big enough to reach up that high. Now, in the far corner of the cabin, Taylor's light fell on a trap door, and it was kind of propped open at an angle, and it had kind of rusty hinges barely holding it in place. It looked like it had been part of the original cabin, maybe a door that led to an old root cellar or storage space. And there was kind of this like weird metallic smell coming from it. As Taylor approached and got closer, he could also kind of hear the strange humming drifting up from below. At this point, they all began to get a really bad feeling about being here, like there was just something really wrong. And so Mike begins to try to get Taylor's attention that they should leave right now. But when that was going on, Taylor was kind of shining his light around, just sweeping it around the cabin, and his light caught something big moving below them through the floorboards, just this large shape moving towards the open door in the floor. And then came this rumbling sound that kind of seemed to vibrate the entire cabin. And all of a sudden, the trapdoor suddenly burst upward, splintering apart as this massive dark shape exploded out of the hole. And these two yellow eyes just locked onto them. And in all the chaos and the frantic flinging of their flashlights, they could see rows of yellow teeth and a face that looked warped and distorted. Taylor's friend screamed, dropped his phone, plunging that side of the cabin into darkness. And the shape was moving fast, way too fast, and was making these horrible sounds. Now Mike was pretty much the first to react. He yelled for everyone to get out and shoved the person nearest to him toward the door. Taylor felt something rush past him in the darkness, something big enough to make the floorboards creak and just groan under their weight. Everybody was scrambling for the door, and then someone, bam, slammed into him from behind, knocking him into the wall, and he could hear these growling sounds getting closer to him. The door was still only halfway open from when they'd first entered. Now 4 people were trying to squeeze through it at once, and so Taylor got pushed up against the door frame so hard he felt splinters dig into his arms, and he could feel this hot breath on his neck. And they burst out of the cabin and into the clearing, and nobody stopped running. They just crashed through the brush, the branches, all whipping their faces, and Taylor could hear whatever it was crashing through the woods behind them, but he didn't look back. They all just ran, and nobody was really following the game trail anymore. They were just running straight through the forest, trying to get as far away from that cabin as possible. Taylor's lungs were burning and his legs felt like they were on fire, but the sound of something big moving through the woods behind them kept them going. And Mike was yelling about something getting back to the main trail, but Taylor couldn't tell which direction that even was anymore. It was just complete chaos at this point, and it was almost completely dark. The only light came from one phone that somebody was still holding as they ran, because the rest had been dropped back in the cabin through all the chaos. Taylor's foot caught on a root, and he went down hard. Now he scrambled to get back up, his hands were shaking in the cold mud, and so one of his friends grabbed his arm and yanked him to his feet, and at this point they could hear the crashing sound getting closer from behind. They all burst through a thick patch of trees, and suddenly it looked like they were back on the main trail. Taylor recognized the bent tree they'd passed earlier. Mike was screaming at everyone to turn left, that the parking lot was that way, but they could hear whatever was chasing them breaking through the tree line behind. And so they began sprinting up the trail, their feet wet and slipping on the ground, and Taylor's chest felt like it was going to explode. He could barely see where he was going, and the only thing keeping him moving was the sound of these heavy thuds coming from behind him, and he couldn't tell if they belonged to his friends or something else. Now, the trail suddenly forked in a way Taylor didn't remember from earlier. Michael took the right path without even hesitating, but about 30 seconds of running, the trail just dead-ended at a cliff face. They'd clearly gone the wrong way, and so they all turned around to backtrack, but now they could feel something strange. It was like this vibration coming up to the soles of his shoes. The whole ground seemed to be humming. One of his friends stopped and said that something felt weird, like static electricity was making all their hair stand on end. And the vibration got stronger, and Taylor could hear this low rumbling sound coming from somewhere beneath them, and it didn't sound like it was anything natural. It was mechanical, like machinery, but deeper. They're very aware that this large bear or predator is trying to come after them, and so Michael's whispering to them that they need to be quiet. And so they all just kind of stood there, barely breathing, listening to the weird humming that was moving up to the earth, while also trying to keep track of where they were and what was happening. And Taylor could feel pins and needles in his legs, like, when your foot falls asleep, except it was spreading up through his whole body. The rumbling began to get louder, and now Taylor could actually feel heat coming from the ground. Now, the one working flashlight they had left started pulsating, just getting brighter and dimmer, like it was breathing. And that's when they heard the crashing in the woods again, but coming from behind them. Whatever had chased them out of the cabin was still there, and they were now trapped between the cliff face and the strange animal that they don't know what it was they were dealing with. And they're all panicking because they don't know what they're going to do or how they're going to get out of the situation. They're convinced they're going to die, and so Michael's quickly looking around trying to think, and he spots a narrow gap between two boulders that looked like it might lead them back to the main trail. They had no choice. The crashing sounds were now getting closer, and that weird electrical humming was making them all feel nauseous. And so, quickly thinking, they all squeezed through the gap, single file, the rocks scraping against their backpacks, and the ground under their feet was hot, like they were walking on a giant heating pad. Their one working phone started going crazy. The screen was just flashing random patterns, and then it would just die completely. They now emerged on what looked like the main trail, but everything looked different in complete darkness. And at this point, Taylor could feel his entire body buzzing like he was touching an electric fence. And all of a sudden, they could hear their car alarm going off in the distance. Through the trees, they could see the parking lot lights, and they knew they weren't far, but the sound also told them something else. That whatever animal had chased them this far, it had now circled around ahead of them. And of course, they were all frozen, because the crashing sounds were now coming from two directions, behind them and up ahead near their car. The rumbling under their feet suddenly stopped, but the air felt charged like right before a lightning storm. Not really knowing how to process the situation and all of these imminent signs of danger around them, Michael just grabbed Taylor's arm, pointed to a drainage ditch that ran alongside the trail, and realized it was their only option. They'd have to use it for cover to try and make it to the car. And they could hear something really big moving through the trees on both sides of them now, and it sounded like it was trying to box them in. Now, the drainage ditch was about 4 feet deep, just enough to stay low while running. So they all crouched down and started moving as fast as they could toward the parking lot. Taylor could hear these footsteps almost pacing them on both sides of the ditch, and every few seconds, they'd catch glimpses of something massive moving through the trees. Whatever it wasn't a typical bear or a wolf or a coyote. This thing was walking on two legs, and Taylor could just hear this deep, raspy breathing. It sounded like it was human, but not quite. And they were getting pretty close now. They were about 50 yards from the car, and Mike just whispered for everybody to stop. Up ahead, illuminated by the parking lot lights, was this huge figure that was clearly standing upright, easily 8 feet tall, And what they were looking at, folks, made all of their blood run cold. What they were seeing had the head of a wolf, but its eyes appeared intelligent, like a human, and it was standing right next to their car like it was waiting for them. The car alarm was still blaring, and in the flashing lights, Taylor was able to see its muscles rippling under its thick dark fur, and its hands, not paws, but actual hands with opposable thumbs, were resting on the hood of their vehicle. Michael pulled something from his pocket, his car keys. He hits the panic button, and all the lights in the car start flashing even brighter. And now this thing turned its head toward the sudden change in lights, and that's when Michael screamed, "Run!" And they just exploded out of the ditch and sprinted for the car. This thing let out this sound that was halfway between a roar and a human scream, and Taylor could hear its claws scraping across the hood of the car as it began to lunge toward them. Michael was already hitting the unlock button. They reached the car just as this thing closed the distance, and Taylor felt something sharp graze his back as he dove into the back seat. The doors slammed shut right as this massive furry arm reached through the window gap trying to grab them. Mike jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life just as this thing slammed its whole body against the driver's side, causing the car to rock violently. And through the window, Taylor was now face to face with it. Its eyes weren't just intelligent, they were glowing this weird yellowish green color, and he could see saliva and what looked like bits of torn, devoured flesh between its yellow, disgusting, sharp teeth. All the while, the tire spun in the gravel as Michael floored it, and this thing held onto the car for a few seconds before it just finally let go. In the rearview mirror, they could all just see it standing in the middle of the parking lot watching them leave. Because it wasn't chasing them anymore, it was just watching. And nobody said a word for the first 20 minutes of the drive back to Boise. They were all just trying to process what just happened. But it wasn't until they got cell service again that Taylor called his brother, who had hunted out in the same region many times and had some very bizarre experiences of his own. As it turns out, his brother had multiple sightings of an upright canine creature in the Sawtooth Mountains. He even had trail cam photos that looked exactly like what they'd seen. Apparently, his brother was so scared about his experiences that he didn't tell anyone because he was convinced nobody would believe him. Taylor's brother sent him a link to this private Facebook group for hunters in the Sawtooth region, and after scrolling through the posts, Taylor realized their encounter wasn't some freak incident, because over the past 5 years alone, there had been dozens of similar sightings in that exact area. The thing was, when people would write in their posts that they had reached out to Fish and Game about this, their post would soon be deleted within just a matter of days. And interestingly, there was one hiker in particular from about 3 months prior to this incident that had a very similar experience, and that they talked about these strange electrical sensations and underground vibrations. Now, supposedly, the Department of Energy had built some kind of research facility in the Sawtooth Mountains back in the 1980s, but the public has never been made aware of any sort of research that they'd been doing. 2 days after their experience, Taylor drove past the turnoff to that hiking trail, and there was now a brand new gate across the entrance with signs saying the area was closed for environmental studies. There were also fresh tire tracks leading up to the gate that looked to be from large vehicles, perhaps military vehicles. Now, to this day, Taylor prefers not to talk about his experiences for fear of ridicule and only confides in those he trusts. The strange, upright canine they encountered that evening remains unknown. On a hot afternoon in August of 2017, Scott Yeoman stood in the driveway of his new house on the outskirts of Bailey, Colorado, unloading renovation supplies from his truck. He and his wife had just bought this house a few weeks earlier, and they'd been spending pretty much every day fixing it up. The house needed a lot of work. The previous owners hadn't done any maintenance for years, and it really showed. The walls needed fresh paint, the floors needed refinishing, and there were dozens of small repairs that needed attention. Scott grabbed another box of supplies and headed towards the front door. He and his wife were working on the back portion of the home. They'd already repainted most of the front rooms, and now they were slowly making their way toward the back of the property. At this point, the August heat was brutal. Scott could feel sweat running down his back as he carried the supplies inside, and he'd already made several trips back and forth from his truck. He still had more materials to bring in, and so Scott walked to the front door and started making his way through the living room. And he was thinking about all the work they still needed to do in this section of the home. The baseboards needed to be replaced, and there was this one creaky floorboard that kept driving him nuts. But suddenly, Scott stopped dead in his tracks. There was this horrible smell coming from somewhere in the room. He thought that something had died in the walls because that wouldn't be unusual. And so he stood there trying to figure out where this awful smell was coming from, because it wasn't just a normal dead animal smell. I mean, this was really pungent, like rotting flesh and vomit and animal feces all combined into one. It was so bad. And he's walking around the room, checking the corners and the walls and just trying to find the source. Maybe there was a dead raccoon in the crawl space. But the smell seemed to be everywhere at once. And so Scott went to open one of the living room windows to try to get some fresh air flowing, and the window was stuck, of course, probably from years of paint buildup. And he had to really push against the frame to get it to budge. And as he was struggling with the window, something caught his eye outside. It was just a quick flash of movement at the edge of his vision. I mean, it was so fast, he wasn't even sure he'd really seen anything. He stopped messing with the window and just stood completely still. Now, the woods behind their house were dense, and it wasn't unusual to see wildlife. I mean, they'd already spotted deer, foxes, and even a few bears since buying this place. Now, he stayed at the window for a moment, scanning the tree line, expecting to see a bear or maybe a deer moving through the brush, but the woods were just still. Not even the branches were moving. And Scott was about to go back to working on the window when that horrible smell suddenly got much stronger. It was so intense now that he could practically taste it. And that's when he heard something moving just outside. So Scott turns and froze, because standing there just on the other side of the window was something he couldn't explain. At first, his brain tried to make sense of it by telling him it was a bear, but this thing was like nothing they'd ever seen. It was massive, and the way it was standing, the way it was moving, it wasn't like an animal. Now, luckily, Scott happened to have his cheap Kodak camera with him, and he'd been using it earlier to document some of the renovation work. And without taking his eyes off of this thing, he slowly raised his camera and snapped several photographs. The entire time, this thing was just standing there, looking right back at him, and he knew he needed to get his gun. He had stored it in another room for protection since they were so far in the woods. Scott backed away from the window as carefully as he could because he didn't want to make any sudden movements, and he kept his eyes locked on this animal until he reached the hallway. Once he was out of sight, he ran to get his gun, and the whole time he's thinking about how this can't be real, how could this be happening? But when he got back to the living room with his gun, it was still there. But something had changed. It was like this thing could sense danger, and as soon as he came back with the gun in hand, it began to move away from the window, and within seconds, it disappeared into the night. He just stood there for a moment with his gun still pointed at the window. His heart was racing so fast he couldn't hear anything else. He wasn't sure what to do next, but he knew he needed to call someone. So he pulled out his phone, called the police, and as you can imagine, he tried to keep his voice steady as he explained what had just happened. But he could tell the dispatcher didn't really believe him. She just kept asking him if what he saw was a bear, and he wasn't sure. Well, 3 officers would eventually show up at his house, and he led them through the property and showed them where this thing had been standing outside. And of course, the officers, they walked around the perimeter. They looked for any tracks or evidence, but they couldn't really find much. Now, Scott pulled out his camera and showed them the photos he'd taken. 2 of the officers just stared at the camera screen, and they were amazed by what they were seeing. But the 3rd officer, he just shook his head and insisted that it had to be a bear. The officers spent about an hour searching everything, and They wrote up their official report, concluding that Scott had probably just seen a large black bear. After the police had left, Scott went back inside, downloaded the photos from his camera onto his computer, and then something happened that was extremely bizarre. A fire broke out in the home, and the fire ended up destroying his computer with the video footage on it. The only evidence that survived were the photographs he'd taken with his Kodak camera. And for the longest time, he didn't tell anybody about what happened that day. Not his friends, not his family, nobody. And he kept those photos hidden for several years because he was afraid people would think he was just crazy if he showed them. Well, finally, in 2020, Scott decided that it was time to share his story. He felt like maybe somebody out there had seen something similar, and maybe his photos could help other people who had their own unexplainable encounters. Scott posted them online, and he explained that there was a story behind them. He told people about that evening in August, about the smell, about the creature, and he said that he hoped people would find something useful if they ever came across something similar. These photos that Scott took are now considered some of the best pieces of Bigfoot evidence ever captured in Colorado. Others claim that they're just a bear, but look at them. That doesn't really look like a black bear to me. But there are others that insist that this doesn't show a Bigfoot, but rather something science can't explain. Now, to this day, whatever animal it was watching Scott through the window remains unknown.
Okay, so my name is Allie. I live in Aldergrove, British Columbia. Yeah, so I have what I think is a bit of a crazy story. My dad, who is a major skeptic, he became a definite believer after this situation. It started in it was the September of 2010. I had a best friend, and when we were both, she was 14 and I was 15, my dad was single and her mom was single, so we thought that we should do the ultimate thing and make our parents together. And then we could not only be best friends, but we could be siblings. So we did that, and it actually worked, and our parents dated for a while, and then we decided let's all be a happy family and move in together. But the house that they were living in was too small, and the house that we were living in was too small, so we decided to find a house together, and we had picked Aldergrove. And at that time, Craigslist was the place to find places to rent. So that's where we went. We went onto Craigslist and we found this home, and we went and we looked at it, and it was gorgeous. Like, I couldn't even imagine living in a house this nice. I couldn't understand how it was the price that it was. It was only $1,800 a month to rent. And it was a huge house. It was 6 bedrooms. It was in a U shape, and then it had a hot tub deck in the middle, and all of our bedrooms had either French doors or sliding doors onto the patio deck. It was just very unique, very gorgeous, on a huge amount of property. The backyard, like where our French doors opened up, there was a hill and it went down, and they had like a lake in the backyard. It was absolutely gorgeous. We obviously we're like, yes, of course we're going to take this. And then when it came to moving day, the owners were like, oh, do you want a bed? Do you want a couch? They basically were like, here, just take all the furniture. We're moving to the Baja. And at the time, we didn't think it was weird. We just thought, oh, well, they're just moving, and they're moving to somewhere smaller, and they don't have all this place for this furniture. We didn't think it was they were trying to get the heck out of Dodge. But we soon found out that was definitely the reason. So we moved in, and everything was fairly normal. We had a Halloween party in October, and we invited a huge amount of people, like my friends, my sister's friends, my dad's friends, everybody. It was probably around 100 people in the house and like around the area. And then about a week later, me and my sister were home, and we heard this massive bang. Like the whole house went bang, and all the animals were like, my dog was barking and the cats were standing, and all their hair was like standing on end. And my sister and I were like, what's that? Like, what was that? And we couldn't figure it out. So we were like, okay, well, that was really weird. I guess my sister, she had heard whispering. Like when she was in the living room, she heard whispering like the days following. And a week after that, she moved out. She was like, you guys are crazy for staying in this house. Like, I'm leaving. And she moved to her dad's house. So then it was just me, my dad, my stepmom, and we had a tenant down below. We had the living room, and then it had a spiral staircase down to the basement, and it was an unfinished basement, but off to the side there was a room, and in that room was kind of like a studio apartment, a very small one, but that's where he lived. Probably about a month later, I was in the living room, and I hear what sounds like someone coming down the hallway and then come into the kitchen, open up cupboards, turn on a tap as if they were getting like a drink of water or something. And I'm like, oh, Dad, like I asked him a question. I don't remember what the question was now, but I asked him something and I didn't hear a response. And so I'm like, why aren't you answering me, kind of thing? So I go into the kitchen and the sink's running and the cupboard's open, but there's nobody there. So I'm like, oh, well, maybe he just left or something. But then I clue in that I hear the lawnmower running, and he's down, like way, way down in the lawn, like way out in the field, mowing the lawn. There's no way he could have made that time within like 5 seconds. So it wasn't him. My stepmom was at work, and my sister wasn't living with us. So I was like, that was really weird, but okay. So turn the tap off, close the door. Things are starting to kind of ramp up. So now, like, I'm hearing voices, my stepmom's hearing voices. We're telling my dad about this stuff, and he's like, you guys are crazy. Like, there's nothing happening here. And while this is going on, my dad one time he came home and he found laundry, like, shoved in, like, the washer, like, literally exploding with laundry. And he's, like, looking through the clothes, like, where did this stuff even come from? Like, this isn't Allie's, this isn't, like, my wife's. Like, where is this clothes coming from? And so he's thinking we're doing all these weird things, and he comes home and, like, the taps are on, and, like, the bathroom was flooded one day, and he's like, what are these girls doing? Like, get your head straight, kind of thing. So then this is progressively, things are ramping up, and so now my mental health is depleting. Even when there wasn't something happening, you always felt like something was watching you. And if you didn't feel like something was watching you, then you would have a nightmare. Like, it was almost every day something was happening. I don't know about Morgan because she had left so early, but for me, I had horrific nightmares, and I don't even know how to, like, yes, of course, the typical, like, demonic nightmares, and something's watching you, and there's something dark around you. You just kind of dream of shadows. But there was also these really, really, the best, I know it's swearing, but, like, mind dreams. Like, they were horrible, like things you don't even want to talk about, like just completely messed with your mind. And when you wake up, you're like, is that a reality? How could that person do that to me? Did that even happen? Like, is this a recalled memory? I had a lot of dreams of, like, being choked. So like black hands, like, choking me, or like there was a lot of dreams where I would be laying in my bed and there was, like, dark shadowy figures around me, like clawing at me, grabbing at me, like pulling at me, but physically, no, it was just dreams. But the dreams, you almost felt like you were awake. Like, you could sleep a whole night and you would not feel rested because your dreams were just so vivid and constantly happening. It was almost like you were running a marathon throughout your sleep. So I slipped into a really bad depression, and I went to my grandma, who she's extremely Catholic, and so she's like, it's demons, it must be demons. So she came over and she did an exorcism, because that's what she thought this was. So she's literally running around the house with holy water and rosaries, and my dad is thinking, these girls are crazy. What is going on in this house? Which ended up, I think, provoking whatever it was. So nothing had got better, and I wasn't really sure if this was reality or if I was going crazy, because my dad is saying, no, you guys are nuts. Oh my God, I'm getting, like, chills. One time I had a dream about this thing that was, like, horned with, like, a long tail, and it had, like, toad hooved feet, and it was huge. and it was just dark. Like I couldn't see color or anything about that, but I could just see like the outline of the scaly, hooved, longed thing. And it would never come around the bed, but it was always just like behind my bed in the room that I had, because it was literally a solarium. All of the rooms were different, but they all had doors going out to the patio. But this one was, I think it was a solarium, and they turned it into a room. So I had my bed in this kind of cove area, and so it was just windows all around me, and I didn't have it up against the wall, so I could just kind of put like lights and little things behind it. It was like peer over the side. Like you could see like the outline of scales slightly, but it had like a yellow eye, kind of yellow, more like orange, but just looked evil, like just so evil. The thing that like was the pivotal moment of, okay, I either am going completely bonkers, or this is like a parallel universe or something, was I was in the shower. You know how I was saying like the water sometimes like would be left on and the bathroom would be flooded, so there was a lot of activity in the bathroom. Well, we had one bathroom that had a shower. We had like 4 bathrooms, but only one of them had like the shower in the bathroom and stuff. So anyway, so I was in the shower and I could just feel something behind me, but again, I'm trying to just say, oh, it's all in your head, it's all in your head. And then I felt something touch me. Like I felt a hand go down my back, and I know it was a hand because it was cold and I could feel 5 fingers, and I felt it touch my back. And I just screamed, and I jumped out of the bathroom, grabbed my towel, and just ran, like literally ran out of the house in a towel. And it was like, okay, well now what do I do? Because now I have no phone and no way. And I'm just like in a towel, like tiptoeing through the house, trying to find my phone and run back out of the house and call my dad. And so I ended up going to the hospital because I was just I didn't know what was real anymore. Like it was so bad. And I ended up living there for a month. Then my dad and stepmom came to the hospital and they said, you're not crazy. There is something going on with the house. Because I guess when I was gone, then it was only my dad and my stepmom. So there's nobody else who could be doing these things, and things were still happening and getting worse. For example, the stuff that my dad seen was he would be in bed and he'd see like the door handle jiggling into the bedroom, lights turning on and off. The front door, it was the weirdest front door. It had keys to the front, like to the inside and the outside. Complete like fire hazard. Like if you didn't have a key to get out of the house, then you would like have to bust a window or something to get out or go a different door. The front door, the point of that is that there's no way that the front door could lock unless you had the key. So if you went out the front door and you didn't lock it behind you, there's no way that the door could lock because you have to have a key to do it, right? Anyway, so he had went out and the door would be locked, and he like to come back inside and he's like, what? It's like the door's locked, I'm home alone, like what is going on here? And he's like banging at the windows and stuff like that, and he saw a shadow like pass by, and he's like still going at the door, and all of a sudden the door unlocked, and then he was like, what is going on? Like my dad's friend who was the tenant, he lived downstairs, and unfortunately he's not alive anymore, so we can't really ask him, but he would not talk about, he only lasted a month, not even a full month actually. He gave some excuse of like, oh, I want to be in Surrey. My dad's like, well, you work all over the place, like, you know, and he's like, no, I'm moving. And then a few years later when my dad was talking about the house, he said, yeah, I had experiences. He's like, that basement was, all of us were terrified to go down in that basement. It looked like they had it as set up as a shop, like the old owner had it as his shop. And so along the front side, it was like a workbench that was physically built in. And then to the right it looked like there was more like turntables, like music stuff, like all from the 70s. And then to the right was all still their stuff. Like they had boxes and boxes of all their stuff. And that's where my dad thinks that like when he looks back now, he thinks that that's where the clothes came from for the laundry, because when he was pulling all the clothes out of the washer. He's like, this isn't Allie's, this isn't Morgan's, this isn't my wife's, like, whose clothes is this? So he suspects that it came from those boxes downstairs. It's not like things happen down there like they did in the living room and the kitchen, but it just felt so evil down there, so dark and so evil. And when you were in other parts of the house, you felt watched, but when you were downstairs, it felt like something was like right behind you, like physically like looming over you right behind you, like at any second you could be grabbed or touched. If you went in the basement, or if you had to get something from the basement or put something in the basement, you would run, like literally run, or I would just like avoid doing it. If my dad said, oh, go put that in the basement, I'd be like, yeah. But the living room, like, I wouldn't sit in the living room unless there was somebody else in the living room. It was something about the living room and kitchen area that was where all the activity happened. And so it's interesting because that was an addition. The living room and the kitchen was an addition to the original home that was there. So I'm not really sure if that plays anything into it, but I guess because now, like, Morgan's out of the house, which is my stepsister, me, the tenant, and it's just them alone in the house. And so when she wasn't home, he saw doorknobs like shaking to get in. He would hear the voices and he knew, like, oh, there's no way, like, I know I didn't leave that TV on. Or he would hear things down the hallway and he knew that his like wife was away working, and she worked in Surrey at the time, which is like approximately half an hour to 45 minutes away from our house. I got back from the hospital, and during that time period I had a boyfriend who also thought that I'm crazy, which didn't really help. We were just kind of hanging at home. I hadn't gone back to school yet, and he was over at the house, and it was just him and I. My dad was at work, my stepmom was at work. We're sitting in my room and the door's closed, and we hear footsteps down the hallway. And not only do we hear the footsteps down the hallway, we see like a shadow pass in front of the door, like, you know how footsteps would be, right? Well, we see those shadows too. And all the color just drained from his face. And I'm like, I told you. And then as soon as that moment passed, we're like, okay, well, what do we do now? Because now we're home alone, and like, we just saw this thing go by. So we basically just camped out in the room, and I called my dad to leave work, and he came and rescued us, essentially, which was just coming home and getting us out of the house. And then that same night, my boyfriend had spent the night because I was too scared to sleep alone. And we're woken up to someone in the kitchen, and then we hear smashing, like all the pans and pots and stuff it sounds like someone's like taking them out and just smashing them all over the kitchen. So we're like, what the hell is going on? Like, so we all come out of the bedrooms and we look, and all the stuff in the kitchen is just all over the ground. Rice and flour and just stuff is all over the kitchen. And we're like, nobody wanted to go in there because we were terrified of what's going on, right? So we all just kind of like retreated back into our rooms. And the way the house was situated was, it was like a U like this, and this back part, the entire back part, was the main bedroom. I guess it used to be an original trailer, and they just turned it into a huge room. So that was my parents' room, and we all just kind of hid in that room for the night. The next morning we go out, and it literally looked like something was like walking through all the the flour and the rice and the oatmeal and stuff. It looked like something had walked through it. It looked like there was something that had 3 toes, like scuffing, but it did look like there was like 3-toed feet walking through. So then for the next bit, we ended up just kind of staying all in that one room. We all just kind of slept in that room together. And then when that wasn't obviously sustainable, that only lasted a couple days, I asked my boyfriend's parents if I could live with them, and I moved out. And then my stepmom and my dad are now fighting like crazy, and she ends up moving out. So then now it's just my dad alone in the house, and he's never missed a day of work, and he never gets sick, but he was so sick from not sleeping and having all this stuff happening around the house that, you know, he's never believed before, and then now it's like happening to him, that he ended up not going to work. one of those days, like I can't remember exactly what it was, but he had taken a day off, like a whole week of work. And so I went to the house and I was like, well, why don't we set up a camera? Like we had a video camera. So we did, and we set it up in the living room, which seemed to be like the living room and kitchen seemed to be like the most active. That night it was lots of, like, it sounded like a TV was on or whispering. We couldn't really tell, but we could hear voices. We heard like walking around, which is mostly what we heard throughout the whole span of this time we lived there. The next morning we checked the camera, and so where the camera was faced, there was this wall, and at the back of the wall it had a built-in record player, because it was a very, very old house, and it had, like, you know, that orange stained glass from the 70s. It had that, and it had lights behind that, and so the lights were always on, and then it had like a chandelier. It looked like something had passed in front of that, because it looked like the lights were kind of going in and out, and then off the living room was where my bedroom used to be, and the door was like half open, and so we see this something pass in front, and then we see the door kind of open, and we're just like, like, this is real, like this is actually, like, we caught this on film. And then I guess my dad said he doesn't really talk about what happened to him when he was alone at the house, but he said that he ended up taking that video camera, like the whole video camera, and burning it, because he said that it pissed it off so much. Yeah, he went and burnt it in the back of the yard, because he's like, I don't even know what else to do. This one time, we came home, was a fireplace in the living room. So actually the fireplace was like, the kitchen living room was like this, and the fireplace was in the middle, like in an island, and then you could walk around the fireplace. And so in that fireplace, when we came home, there was a log that had been burnt, and nobody was there, because this tenant downstairs had moved out already. So now at this point, it's just me, my dad, and my stepmom. And like, yeah, Morgan came and visited all the time. She just didn't live in the house. There was a log that had been burnt, and we didn't use the fireplace because, you know, like insurance and all that type of stuff. Like, we don't know the last time the chimney was cleaned. So we never used it. So it's like, did someone break in and burn a log in our house? Like, and as you saw, like, we are off the beaten path. So it's not like people are breaking in out there. Like, it's not like in the inner cities or something. So during that week that he was off, on the property, like, it was a very, very long driveway. And we lived at the top, and then at the very bottom, there was a trailer that I guess the owner also had rented out. And so he went down to that trailer and was like, I'm going to sound crazy to you guys, but do you have any weird things happening here? And the guy looked him dead in the eye and said, he was this Jamaican man, and he's like, no, man. He's like, yeah, we have weird stuff happening, but probably not as bad as happening at your house. And my dad was like, wow, this is like, what? And so he said, yeah, like when they first moved here, it sounded like someone was breaking into their house, and he would get up in the middle of the night with a bat, and there'd be nobody there, but the window would be open or the door would be open. And it's like, I know I locked the door and stuff like that. I guess the guy was also kind of thinking if he was crazy, but I guess they had lived with it for so long that they're like, oh, this just lives in our house. And so the guy said, my friend is a medium or shaman, or I don't know, some friend that he had. And he said, if you're up for it, like, would you be interested in having him come to the property and trying to communicate? And my dad was like, sure, like, I'm leaving. Just do whatever you want. Like, I'm not living here anymore. So sure. So he came, and apparently what was discovered, the original owner of the house, so when we rented the property, there was a man and a wife. The man looked about 100 years old, and the wife looked probably 50. And so the man had a wife, and they were originally building the house. And that was that original addition where the main bedroom was. And then the wife died of cancer, and he got a new wife. And then that new wife, they started building the rest of the house. Her daughter died. What this medium had discovered was that it was like this spiritual warfare between the wife, the daughter, And allegedly there was this other entity who lived there from the 1800s with the original property owner who still lived there. So they're all like fighting over who is going to live on this property. That's what he said, right? Like, how do you fact check that? The only thing I could fact check is, yes, the wife did die, and yes, the daughter did die. She died on the street in a car crash coming out of the parking lot. Like coming out of our driveway, I should say. Those people did actually pass away. So I don't know if like the media knew that or what. This is what kind of like made me believe the medium more, because we never told them what avenues we tried to get rid of whatever was in the house. Like we never said, oh, we tried this or we tried that. We just said, this is what we're experiencing. And so when the medium came, she said that he didn't say when my grandma came, but she said that someone who came who was spreading holy water or something like that, they were chasing it around the room. And so remember when I was saying like my grandma and my aunt were physically going around my room, like they were going into my closet and they're going under my bed and they were going all over the room. Well, this person said that they were feeling that they were chasing this thing around the room. So I don't know, but apparently this person physically saw, like when they were regaining, however they do their psychic, whatever they do, they saw this thing being chased around the room by my grandma who was throwing holy water around the room. I was born and raised Ukrainian Catholic. There is no good entities. It's just like when someone dies, they go to heaven or they go to hell and that's it. And so there's no like, oh, if your grandpa comes, that's nice. It's like, no, you're either crazy because you think you're experiencing spirits, or you're not and it's just like a cat walking by or something. There's no middle ground. And so even if there was a good entity in our house, like not, how do I say this? Not good, but just, like someone who's passed on, my grandma still would have done the things that she did because in her mind she's trying to pass them along or get them to where they need to go or get them out of the house. So I don't think my grandma physically knew what she was doing. She was just trying to get something out of the house. Before I had went to the hospital, before my dad had said, oh, this is reality, my dad was at the grocery store in Aldergrove, just like at the local grocery store, and he ran into a friend from way back when, like someone he knew in high school. He's like, oh, hey, how's it going? And like, oh, what are you doing in Aldergrove? And my dad said that, oh, we moved here and stuff. He's like, yeah, my dad was describing, oh, it's this beautiful house and it has a lake and there's fish in it. I can go fishing. And he's just talking about this house. And the guy says, he starts describing the house. He says, is it like a house? It's got a U and there's a hot tub deck. And my dad's like, yeah, that's the house off 10th Avenue. He's like, yeah. He's like, oh, I heard some crazy went down at that house. Oh, sorry. But he's like, oh, like, what do you mean? And he said, oh, well, yeah, I went there to do some electrician work and it was my day off. And so I went there with my wife. And when my wife was walking around with the owner's wife, and the owner's wife was saying that she can't live in this house anymore because she's seeing like apparitions of her daughter all over the property. And so she doesn't know if she's going crazy or if she's really seeing these things. And so they're leaving, they're selling everything and they're going to the Baja. And so my dad had heard that and he was like, kind of like, oh yeah, okay. Like, and so then when this medium said it's the spiritual warfare between the daughter and the wife, he's like, what? Like,
after our interview, Allie reached out to her father to dig for additional information or any memories that he had. And in fact, she shared these texts with me. Allie's stepmother had a grandson who was just a baby at the time and was over at the house visiting. At the time, the stepmom was in the kitchen with him in the living room, and she came back to him taken out of his car seat. Days after the interview, the plan was for Allie to call her father and record him answering just a few questions because she thought it would be great for the interview. However, her father simply couldn't. He was too terrified to relive the moments he had endured at the house alone. It brings him back to the most frightening moments of his life. He felt that when you're fighting the supernatural, you're helpless and there's nothing you can do.
After on, I realized that it was just what was going on, but during that time period, I also thought I was going going through dietary problems because I was always nauseous too. Like I was always feeling sick and I was getting headaches. And so then I thought, oh, well, maybe there's something going on with what I'm eating, or maybe I'm not drinking enough water or something like that. But nothing I did, I still had that problem. But after I moved out, the problem was gone. So then I looked back and, well, must have been what was going on, because other people were experiencing that too. Morgan had moved out. I was living at my boyfriend's house, and I can't live there because I was just temporarily living with his family. And my dad was like, oh, well, at this time I was 19 years old. So he's like, that's, she needs to be living at home and working on her schooling and not just living at a boyfriend's house. He wasn't with his girlfriend anymore. And so and then also because now she's not living there, they're not together anymore. So now it's just his income taking care of the house. And yes, the rent wasn't that much to heat a house of that size. And we had to pay for water of a house of that size. And there was a lot of bills that, one person can't do. And then, like I was saying, he had never missed work. And so for him to be physically sick and not sleeping for a week, he was just like, this is crazy. And I think at the end of it, he ended up living at my grandma's house until we were like, okay, we can go in and move all the stuff. We made sure we made a day that we all would be there together, so nobody was alone at the house, because we were physically scared for our safety, because if whatever this is can physically pick up a pot and a pan and move doors and stuff, is what's stopping it from physically hurting us or touching me in the shower. It's no longer there. Actually, I went to take my daughter there. So I actually only live a few blocks away from it now. But ironically, in this weird twist of events, we lived in the house, we all moved out, and I moved to Surrey, and my stepmom moved away. We all moved away. And then when I was older and looking to purchase a home, I was like, oh, Aldergrove's pretty cheap. So I ended up purchasing a home rather close to it. But anyways, I was telling my daughter oh, I used to live in a house really close to here. Do you want to go look at it? And so we drove down, and it's completely gone now. The whole house is demolished. I tried actually going back into historical records and trying to find how the land was plotted out, but I didn't really know what to look for. But according to the median, yeah, there was an owner in the 1800s, and he owned it and died, or something to do with arrowheads. I don't know how truthful or accurate that is, but that's what they said. And then there was this new owner that bought it in the 40s, I believe, and then he owned it. Well, now that I'm older and now I'm a mom, so now I have this mama bear mentality about me. If I was me now living in that house without children, I would never put my children through that, probably would have, maybe invited some paranormal people into it, or maybe tried to go to a historian and done more research on the property and tried to see what I could figure out more. But definitely, if I already had went to the hospital because I'm thinking I'm going crazy, or things can physically touch you, because from what I hear, there's entities that can't really break through the veil and they can't touch you, but sometimes they can, or some things can touch you. And if this thing or things were physically able to touch us and touch things, then who knows what could have happened if we stayed longer. I'm honestly curious though of if the people who live there now experience things, if somebody from the 1800s was still living there and it was a completely new house, then who knows if the spirits, the wife and the daughter, are still there, right? Where we live, we live about an hour and a half from Harrison, which is Sasquatch country. Almost so many people who go way up in that area, they all have heard the tree knocking and the whooping, and the amount of experience that people have had out here, especially in the 4x4 community and the camping community and stuff. It's just common knowledge. We have a lot of UFO stuff here. They say Aldergrove's a UFO hotspot, and so many people that I know say that they've saw the black triangle where it has the yellow. So many people, almost everybody I know, has said that they've saw that at one point living in Aldergrove. In a way, it's kind of made me more of a skeptic. It's hard to explain. So it makes me more of a skeptic, because when people say oh, I thought I heard something, or I put this thing down somewhere and then it appeared somewhere else. It's like, because I have had real legitimate things happen to me and my entire family, now I'm like, okay, maybe it's just a slip of the mind, or maybe you thought you heard something. And so now I'm more skeptical of when people say that they are having legitimate experiences. And then, when they explain it more, or I hear stories more, I'm like, okay, yeah, that's believable, or I could see that happening. Or, how some people just like to embellish stories, or say that they've had these things happen, can legitimately vouch for how you feel when those things happen, or what it's like when those things actually happen. I came to your channel because I wanted to hear other people's experiences. Yeah, like, see how, if it is like intertwined, or if they're all separate things, or like, is the whole Sasquatch and UFO thing, is that a separate thing than the like spirit world, or is that all connected, or like, it's just, I don't know, maybe someone has the answer. I don't know, but it's definitely, it's not that like it's all the content I consume, but it's definitely a big part of my life now. Like, I'm not sitting here like researching constantly, but I definitely enjoy hearing other people's experience. It kind of makes like more of a community that, yeah, it is a reality, and like, you're not crazy, and don't go and medicate yourself a bunch, because these things do actually happen to people, and like reputable, everyday, normal people. You don't choose these things. Like, yes, some people who are paranormal hunters, they run into it, guns a-blazing, but there are just normal everyday people who go out in the wilderness, or move into a house and something crazy happens to them. So I think that when you feel like something's happening, or think like something's happening, to trust your instincts 100%. Like, yes, you could have maybe mistakenly put your glasses somewhere, and you thought you put them somewhere else, and now they're somewhere else. Yes, that does happen. But if you feel like, if that happens and you feel uneasy and you hear voices, like, it's not always that you're going crazy. You should trust your instincts.